Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us at the Project Censored Radio Show. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, your host for this segment, and we are very glad right now to be joined by Chris Garaffa, who is a technologist and co-host of the weekly podcast CovertAction Bulletin. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be back on the show. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's start by let's go back to go forward. Can you give listeners a brief rundown of what net neutrality is and why it matters?
Yeah, net neutrality is a really simple idea, and it should not be controversial. It just says that all internet traffic should be treated the same, meaning that you can't prioritize access to one site over another. This has become particularly interesting when we talk about streaming services like Netflix and Hulu and others, because media conglomerates also own a number of these services, like Hulu, but then there's independent services like Netflix, right? And so the media companies try to say, and again, this is where the biggest conversation about this comes in, is, they try to say, well, Netflix is very expensive for us because video uses a lot of bandwidth. And so we're going to, what if we could charge you more to have a faster Netflix connection, but your Hulu connection, for example, would still be the same? And opposing that is the basis of net neutrality. There's a lot of other parts to it, too. What if somebody, Comcast could just block you from getting to Netflix unless you paid more to them for a special Netflix package? I mean, think back to, cable TV, where you had to buy, all of the channels that you wanted to watch outside of the basic, 13 or so, back in the day, when you had to actually, go and buy the package that had ABC Family and Disney Plus, except the cable companies, had there was reason for them to do that. Not great reason, but there was some technical reason for them to do that. Whereas with the internet providers, right, AT&T, Verizon, and others, there isn't really a good technical reason for them. It's all about money. Imagine, too, if you had to buy a news subscription for your internet access. So you could only get to whatever Comcast websites, whatever websites Comcast said that you could get to for news, and you had to pay extra for independent media for an unlimited package. It sounds a little far-fetched, but it's something that is a very real possibility without net neutrality.
Yeah, thank you. You really helped highlight the myriad ways that this can affect somebody's ability to access even something as simple as a news site, which, of course, in the days of shadow banning and outright censorship, it seems not as far-fetched as perhaps it once it did. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's been so much going on, not least of all the threat of a nuclear holocaust. So people would be forgiven for not following FCC nomination news. But there's been a bit of a hiccup here, perhaps one might say. And so Gigi Sohn, who is a lawyer and telecom regulator veteran who actually advised Tom Wheeler during the Obama administration when he was pushed to defend net neutrality. And I say pushed because I was part of the protests to push him to defend net neutrality. He was not on our side by default. So Gigi has a long history of working in these circles, and it seems that she's liked or was liked at one point by people, Democrats and Republicans, which should suggest that she'd be a shoo-in, so to speak. And yet it's been like over a year, I'd say, that since she was nominated by the Biden administration, and she has yet to be confirmed. And as far as I understand it, she has said that she would go back. Now, Trump got rid of the net neutrality decision, and she has said that she would uphold net neutrality and she would reinstate it. So what's going on? What's the holdup here?
Yeah, so it has been just over a year now. It was very late October 2021 when Gigi Sohn was nominated by Biden. She had hearings in early December of 2021 in front of the Senate Commerce Committee and it's just been stalled. The entire nomination has been stalled. So the way the FCC works is that there are 5 commissioners. There is currently an empty seat. There are 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and this is an empty seat. And that's kind of the agreement that traditionally had been, in place, that, there were 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and then the party in power, in Congress and or the White House got to nominate, someone who is a little bit of a moderate, into that position. Now, Gigi Sohn, from what I see, is not really a moderate when it comes to these issues. She actually, she comes from, public knowledge. She comes from the Media Access Project and others, which, are very impressive organizations. And I would look forward to her being that 5th commissioner on the FCC. But of course, the Senate Commerce Committee does not want to do that. We are, speaking on the day after the midterm elections in the US. And so, of course, it remains to be seen where Congress is going to be. There are still a number of races. So I'm hesitant to make any predictions at this point. Maybe tomorrow we could. But at this point, I don't want to predict what's going to happen in terms of, the Congress and where it goes. But I think that there could be significant pressure on a new Congress either way, no matter which way it turns out. Because like you said, we had to pressure Obama to get net neutrality. We had to put that pressure on. He was not a fan of it until he realized that there was a significant movement. So we're going to have to do the same for those on the Senate Commerce Committee, for those in the Senate and the House in general, in order to just get a hearing and get, to move forward on the nomination of Gigi Sohn. I think that, that's something that's going to have to happen once the new Congress comes into play and into power in January, no matter who is, technically in control. And it's going to be close either way.
And do you think that, obviously we don't know what's going to happen with Congress, but do you think that she could have her nomination revoked, and then they would try to put someone in who has not said outright that they're a fan of net neutrality?
I think it's certainly possible. I think we have seen already, particularly the Republicans in Congress are trying to block pretty much anything that the Biden administration does, whether, even the most modest proposals of the Biden administration are getting blocked. And so I think that, if there is Republican control of this committee, then I think it's less likely that a smooth confirmation goes through. But again, I think either way, it's a matter of public pressure in order to get that confirmation.
And so I want to get back to the public pressure aspect, but I do want to ask a kind of devil's advocate question here, because I do remember during the net neutrality protests years ago, there were a lot of people that were saying, well, net neutrality is really not even enough. It's part of an old legislative package that didn't know the internet existed. So it's really not even going far enough. So what would you say to that in terms of, are we already too far in a world that is too unlike the one where this Title II was originally thought up?
Well, I think that's a correct position, but it doesn't cover the entire situation. We still need net neutrality. We still need that as just a basic part of our communications infrastructure, even though that infrastructure is owned by private corporations. Particularly because it's owned by private corporations. It's still something we need, but there is so much more to the question that, and I'm glad you asked this because there is much more. Millions of Americans still don't have broadband access at home. So if you can't get on the internet fast enough, then what does it matter if you can watch Netflix or not, or access a news website or a social media page? If you can't get online, then none of that matters. So right now, there is a bill called the Net Neutrality and Broadband Justice Act that has been introduced. It would amend the Communications Act of 1934 to make internet access fall under Title II as a telecommunications service. That would be net neutrality. And the FCC could not undo that. That would actually codify net neutrality into law. Now, this bill has 28 or so co-sponsors, but it hasn't moved. It has not gone anywhere. It was introduced by Senator Markey, but it's just kind of sitting there right now in the Senate. It's been introduced. It's gone absolutely nowhere. So that needs to be addressed, first of all. But past that, we had in the infrastructure bill, the $1 trillion infrastructure bill that was passed and signed by Joe Biden, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Net neutrality was not directly part of that, but they did include money for encouraging broadband extensions, right, to rural America where you don't have broadband currently. But that involves giving the ISPs billions and billions of dollars to basically do that work. But it doesn't require anything of them other than providing, what I consider to be low speed internet access. It's actually not fast enough, right? So that's in there. One thing that did come out of the Infrastructure Act was actually something related to net neutrality, which is municipal broadband networks. And municipal broadband networks would basically mean that your town, your city, your neighborhood, however you look at it, controls the broadband that you have, controls the internet access, and can set prices managed as a public utility. That's what we need more of. We need to take what Comcast and AT&T and Verizon have done, in large part with our tax money, and through the hard work of the people who live in our cities and our neighborhoods, and say, this is actually ours. We fund this. We give you so much money every year in terms of tax breaks, in terms of incentives, to do the bare minimum of providing internet infrastructure. Well, we should actually control that infrastructure. We should decide, where does it go? Who needs it? Let's determine who needs access to this and prioritize getting them access first before doing, some other service or upgrade, for people who already have it. Make sure that it's a right. The UN says internet access is a right for everyone. And in fact, that's been extended to be broadband internet access, whether through satellite, cable, DSL, whatever it is. And that isn't even a reality in the richest country in the world right now.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable, the list of basic rights that are not available to people in the richest country in the world. So I want to ask you, particularly with the municipal broadband question, but also in terms of the larger net neutrality question. Obviously, on Project Censored, we talk a lot about censorship and the ability for the internet, as I understand it, was initially supposed to be a place where people could share pretty much whatever they wanted. Of course, not that's illegal under the First Amendment, but that it is a free speech place. It is a place where people can share ideas, and nothing is supposed to be better than anything else at the outset. And yet, of course, the reality that we live in now is completely not like that concept. And so I'm curious, would net neutrality have any effect, or would municipal broadband have any effect on censorship and being shadow banned and being able to access the internet equally as a content creator?
Only at a very low level. It would prevent your internet connection from saying you don't pay enough to go to this website, or we AT&T don't like this website, so you can't go to it. It would not address the question of people being banned from YouTube, for example, or from Patreon, or from being able to receive donations on PayPal. Which we see all the time. Reporters, journalists, independent media frequently are dealing with this. Just this morning, I saw Wyatt Reed, who's a great reporter and investigator, banned from Venmo for no reason, and they won't tell him why. So unfortunately, net neutrality would not address those kinds of situations, and that's a separate fight that is happening. Part of that is around Section 230. Which is, something that has been a hot topic. Donald Trump, very loudly campaigned, to repeal 230. Joe Biden was a little quieter in his comments about 230, but also said, we need to take another look at it. I'm not a big fan of 230. There hasn't been much real movement either way on action against 230. but the threat remains. That still wouldn't prevent things like PayPal from shutting down somebody's account, right? They say, well, we're a private service, we can do whatever we want. But we see the application of these bans really, and we've seen it certainly throughout 2022, in terms of, who was removed from various services after the Russian military action in Ukraine started very, very quickly. Whether or not you agreed with it or not, that was irrelevant. Whether you said, I support this, or I kind of support this, or I don't support it. So many accounts were shadow banned, they were outright banned, suspended, removed. People's content was just removed from YouTube, with no backup and no way to get it back. I mean, many years of archives of some great shows were just gone. And so, yeah, so net neutrality would not address that, but it's a really good point because that's part of the fight for freedom on the internet.
So in terms of net neutrality, do you feel, I mean, like I said, there's a lot going on, so people would be forgiven for not knowing exactly where net neutrality stands. But what do you feel? What do you feel like the movement will be on net neutrality in the coming weeks or the coming months with everything else that's going on? And how do you feel that people can best like plug into that or get involved?
I mean, one thing I would certainly do is, call up your senators, tell them to support the Net Neutrality and Broadband Justice Act. It's extremely short. It is 2 pages long. It's like a page and a half long, actually, and that's in that legal formatting that bills show up in, right? Encourage them to sign on to it, to push for it to go through the various processes that it has to go through in the Senate to be reconciled with a similar bill in the House. That's something that we need to push right now, as well as in January when the next Congress comes in. I don't think anything's going to happen this year. We're just past the elections. Nothing's going to happen, unfortunately, this year. But I don't want us to wait until this is an urgent issue, when Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, whoever starts implementing rules that violate the principles of net neutrality. We can't wait for that. We should also be pushing for a hearing for Gigi Sohn. Let's get that hearing happening. Let's hear what she has to say. Let's get her up there again. We heard her the first time around, but let's get her up there again and get some actual media attention on it, because we need to see, where is she going to stand? Just give a fair hearing, which is, the basis of a, basic democracy. Just needs to have a fair hearing here. I like I said, I think she would be great from what I've seen so far, but there's still questions that remain. And the purpose of these committees is supposed to, have these hearings, ask questions, and then take action. And they haven't done the last part. And that's really the critical thing. But we need to codify, especially as we get into 2024, we need to codify net neutrality into law. And that's what the Net Neutrality and Broadband Justice Act would do. So I think building movements for that, pushing representatives, pushing senators to do so, working towards municipal broadband in your locality, especially if you live in a moderate sized city. That seems to be one of the best places to start for municipal broadband. It's not an easy fight, but typically the fights that mean the most are the ones that are more difficult.
Absolutely, well put. And I can't help but wonder, I mean, I haven't done this research, but I can't help but wonder how many people standing in the way of Gigi Sohn's confirmation are, if you went to Open Secrets, for instance, and looked at their donors, how many have Comcast and how many have AT&T and all that. Like, I can't help but wonder how much that is standing in the way of this when she has already been outspoken about her feelings about net neutrality. And I'm also curious, just in terms of the municipal broadband net neutrality, do you look at these as parallel fights? Or because if let's say that I lived in some medium-sized town that you mentioned that had municipal broadband, would net neutrality matter to me?
It would still matter because your municipal broadband still has to connect to the backbone of the internet. And there are companies like AT&T, Level 3, and a number of others that actually have that service that they have the cables, they have the underground, they have the underwater cables, and they maintain that infrastructure. And they have agreements with each other. They're called peering agreements. And they say that, we are going to just send our traffic over each other's networks. We're not going to charge for it because it's going to be about an equal share, back and forth. And so you still have those kind of connections to worry about, but it's a huge step in terms of your local ISPs because you can connect to the larger backbone of the internet rather than trying to go through a Comcast first or a Fios first. In terms of donations, it's actually very interesting. If you look at organizational donations in 2022, Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, they give just about equally to Republicans and Democrats, particularly when you're looking at the senatorial and congressional committees on both sides. AT&T actually gives more to the National Republican committees than they do to the Democrats, but they still give tens of thousands of dollars to both sides. And that's a very purposeful, that's not a political question because they agree on abortion or healthcare or whatever it is. That's because they're playing both sides. They're hedging their bets and they're saying, you know what, no matter which side wins, we want to be able to say, hey, we gave you all this money. Like we gave $30,000 to the DCCC, so that helped your campaign, that helped your party get power. So help us out now. They spend, so much money on lobbying, it's ridiculous. We're talking tens of millions of dollars for each of these companies, and it only grows. It only just increases. So I think, when we're looking at the current campaign, the current, season that we're in, that is just ending now, but, I think it's not even a partisan issue in terms of the donations they're making. And really, it's, we have to remember that by and large, both parties are corporate parties. They support, these corporate parties. And net neutrality is one of those issues where Democrats are slightly better. They're a little better on it. Not great, because if they were great, then when we had 8 years of Obama, we would have just had net neutrality. It would have been codified. But, we can say the same thing about Roe. For sure. It's the very similar thing. They talk a good talk, but are they actually going to take action? Are the Democrats on the Senate Commerce Committee taking any kind of action to get a second hearing for Gigi Sohn? No, they're not. Maybe they're playing backroom politics, but they're not making public statements about it until after something awful happens, as we saw with Roe. So I'm not saying that the Democrats are way better, but I think we've seen that they can be pushed a little more, but they can also be pushed by money on the other side. So that's why it's so critical to have these movements rather than just relying on, who you're voting for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought up Roe v. Wade, because I was thinking about that when you mentioned that it would codify this into law. And I'm like, oh, where have I heard that? And of course, in the recent midterm elections, that was, it was brought up like a zombie that wouldn't go away. Like, if you vote for us, we will codify that. And I'm like, where were you the past 40 years? Like, I swear.
Yeah.
And I can't help but feel that, this will be one of those, another one of those issues. Like, well, why codify this into law when we can kind of use this as a carrot and stick each time the midterms come around to remind people why they need us? And so I'm curious, in terms of, I know you said it's a very short bill, which I've never even heard of a bill that's only like 2 pages long. That's remarkable. Is there something, are there loopholes large enough that people like Comcast and the AT&Ts could get through them as it stands with the current like Title II, the way that the FCC would put it, as opposed to this legislation? Are there loopholes that these big telecoms could access, even if net neutrality were put into place by the FCC?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not a lawyer, but in the analysis I've read and in the bill, which, the important part of the bill is actually 11 lines long. Like, what it modifies, existing law to include the offering of broadband internet service for a fee directly to the public, etc. And there's some legal language in there. But I don't see a way. But AT&T has thousands of highly paid lawyers. So does they all do. I am not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not highly paid for my non-legal takes. So I don't think so. The Electronic Frontier Foundation and others have done some really good analysis of this bill, and I would defer to their great analysis on it, which also supports the bill and says which we should get this. But the important thing about it is that having it be under Title II would mean that the FCC can't make any further decisions on it. Again, it is codified into law. It is not something the FCC can go back and forth on depending on who is in that fifth seat.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? So I'm also I'm wondering in terms of the FCC, what's been going on since Tom Wheeler and Obama decided net neutrality, to vote yes on net neutrality, and then Trump overturned it. Have we seen any movement in terms of the big telecoms rushing in to do all the things that they can do now that net neutrality is no longer with us for the time being?
So it's very interesting that the telecoms have not actually been targeting the consumers just yet. They haven't been targeting us with price hikes related to net neutrality. There have been price hikes for sure, and I'm sure most people, can just see that in their monthly budget. But what they're doing is actually going after the content providers like Netflix and saying, you're taking up a lot of traffic on our network and you should pay us extra for that. But if Netflix has to pay extra money, then that means that they still have to maintain their profit. And so that gets passed on back to us anyway. So I mean, Comcast, what is it? Consumer Reports or one of these sites does their most hated company of the year, and like regularly Comcast, wins that contest. I don't remember if it's Consumer Reports or another one, but it's like every year they do it. So they don't want to be like, oh, we're going to charge you more to get on Netflix. They want to pass it along and say we're going to charge Netflix more because they're using more of our resources, which there is very little like technical reason to do that. Comcast is going to have to build, infrastructure. AT&T, they're all going to have to build infrastructure no matter what to maintain the fact that, I mean, during the pandemic, we're still in it, but during the lockdowns, everyone had to work from home. Many people had to work from home. I don't want to forget those folks who still had to go to work, but there was video conferencing, there was Zoom with your friends, with your family, with work, with everyone, just to stay in touch, and they seemed to manage just fine while people were still like watching Netflix while they were working at home all day. So that excuse to me absolutely makes no sense. But that's what they've been trying to do, not just in the US, but also in South Korea, in the UK as well. It's been a movement in a number of countries where the ISPs, internet service providers, are trying to say, well, these services are using a lot of our resources, so they should pay us more.
Interesting, because you'd then think that that you'd hear more about net neutrality from Netflix. I mean, how hard would it be to just put a little pop-up on Netflix? Or so I mean, I don't imagine that you've been in touch with Netflix about this, but can you think as to why they wouldn't want to then push the issue of net neutrality?
Because they rely on so many of these companies for some of their content. Netflix has been moving towards doing their own content. They do some great stuff, but a lot of the shows that are out there on Netflix still from other services, right? Think about, Friends, whatever else you're going to watch, the throwback stuff. That's all from other media platforms, many of whom own either an ISP or, have certain ties to, giant telecommunications companies. So they don't want to annoy those companies too much, but they also don't want to pay them extra just to have their service running.
And with that, I can't remember exactly what it was called. It was before the net neutrality fight, though. But like Wikipedia and a bunch of web pages went dark. It was years ago. It was like 2010 or 2012. I can't remember exactly when. And it was such an amazing moment because you saw like all of these web pages. Oh my gosh, what if the internet looked like this? And I'm curious, do you see something like that being viable again? Or now that things are so, I mean, Facebook is basically just the Atlantic Council and Twitter is now owned by Elon Musk. Like, do you see the internet being able to coalesce into some kind of fight like this again? Or does it really just have to be the grassroots and nothing beyond that?
Well, that was led, Wikipedia, Reddit, and a number of others. And it was so long ago that I don't want to say any other sites that I'm thinking because I don't want to falsely, claim that they engaged or not. But many of the big sites of the day were engaged in that. Reddit, unfortunately, now owned by, was bought by Condé Nast. So I highly doubt that they would get involved in a political statement like that. Many other platforms, I mean, Wikipedia certainly could do it again. Craigslist could do it. Still a big platform. Facebook obviously wouldn't. Netflix wouldn't for the reasons we just talked about. Twitter wouldn't unless Elon Musk thought he was trolling everyone with it. I mean, that's just the reality that we are in today. And that also gets to the centralization of internet services, right? Where we're all on the same like 5 websites every day, rather than, what it used to be back, a decade, 2 decades ago, where there were plenty of sites. But all of that has been kind of concentrated into the social media sites, the streaming media sites, and a handful of news sites.
Yeah, and this brings me rather nicely to my last question. I remember years ago that there was talk of I can't remember his name, but one of the creators of the internet, the original internet, was like, you know what, I'm going to create a new one that's actually going to be like free and open. And I'm wondering, where are we on that? And how do you feel about, I mean, does it feel like just trying to reinvent the wheel? Should we try to fix and democratize and decentralize this space that we already have, or is it too cluttered with corruption? What do you see as a viable option there?
No, we need to democratize the internet. We can't just try to start over especially without learning any of the lessons that we are seeing today. The commercialization of the internet, enhanced tracking and surveillance that exists from corporations and government alike. If we just started a new internet and said it's only for this purpose, academic, entertainment, whatever, we would learn nothing from the mistakes that have already been made, because the internet originally was, it was the Defense Department, it was research universities, and it was private, right? It was just for that, and then they opened it up to corporations, and we see 20, 30 years later where we've ended up. So I think that the movement is really to democratize access to the internet, but also the content on the internet and what happens with the data that we generate all of the time on the internet. That's the fight that, in addition to net neutrality, municipal broadband, they're all related, but that's the fight that we need to have. And really the only way to do that is to have neutral international control over the internet. This is not just a US issue. And I think, in fact, we would be, chauvinistic to say this is just the US should have, these discussions and these debates. The entire world uses the internet. So the entire world should have a say into how the internet is run, with everyone having an equal voice at the table.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know several people who have websites that are hosted in other countries because they're afraid that the US will just shut down their websites. So this is clearly, perhaps there is no other space where borders are as ridiculous and superfluous as the internet. Chris, thank you so much for all of that context and all of that information. Where can people go to hear more of your work?
Yeah, so every Wednesday, the Covert Action Bulletin podcast comes out. You can find it on all of your favorite podcast websites, Apple, Spotify, Google. Search for Covert Action Bulletin. Covert Action is one word. You can hear us in New York City on Wednesday mornings at 99.5 WBAI, also at 9 a.m. Wednesdays, and of course at covertactionmagazine.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris.
Hey, thank you.